A huge judgment as the High Court rules that children cannot consent to body-changing trans treatments. Britain picks playground fights with Dr Fauci and everyone else about how much better it is than them, and Joe Biden's emerging team signals a final end to the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. There was a landmark judgment that made waves across the world this week as the UK High Court ruled that children are not mature enough to consent to the use of hormone treatments, so-called puberty blockers, which are often given as the first step on the trans journey. Specifically, judges said that it was highly unlikely that 13-year-olds and doubtful that 14 to 15-year-olds could understand the full implications of the treatments. As a result, they could not legally give informed consent. In almost all cases, people who take puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormones, which can lead to infertility and other side effects. The Tavistock Clinic, the UK's only clinic providing these treatments to children, has been prescribing puberty blockers to under 16-year-olds since 2011. The number of referrals to it from children have gone up from 97 in 2009 to 2,728 last year, with thousands more on the waiting list. The High Court also said that doctors shouldn't prescribe the drugs to those aged 16 or 17 without first seeking the agreement of the courts. Unsurprisingly, the Tavistock announced it has immediately suspended new referrals for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for children. The case was brought by Kira Bell, now aged 23, who was put on puberty blockers as a teenager, went on to have a double mastectomy, and now regards the whole enterprise to have been a massive, tragic mistake. She now lives as a woman, but she has a deep masculine voice, facial hair, and of course the scars of surgery. She talked about how she decided she must be trans after she discovered US trans influencers on YouTube. The High Court ruled that the use of puberty blockers to treat gender dysphoria is highly experimental with unknown long-term effects. The judges said that the Tavistock had not been able to provide any explanation for the huge rise in referrals over recent years. Now, the trans activist groups were, as you might expect, not very happy. Nancy Kelly, the chief executive of Stonewall, said that the ruling was shocking and could have a significant chilling effect on young trans people's ability to access timely medical support. However, many hailed the judgment as a victory for common sense. The Times newspaper made the case in its leader column on Wednesday. The verdict is a victory for sanity. The Times has in recent years reported the repeated concerns of whistleblowers of the way the Tavistock has been too readily dispensing puberty blockers to children as young as 10, most of whom they believe needed psychological help rather than potentially life-changing treatment. It's an important outcome, not least because not all of the pressure had been one way. Just a couple of weeks ago, a 14-year-old girl identifying as a transgender boy started legal proceedings against the NHS over complaints that her referral to the Tavistock was taking too long. In other words, she was one of those thousands on that waiting list. The Good Law Project, which was acting for her, said that the NHS has a legal obligation to provide specialist care to all patients within 18 weeks or provide an alternative. As a result of the Kira Bell ruling, that specialist care will not now involve puberty blockers or other hormone treatment. That shouldn't mean that all those young people don't get some sort of psychological help for gender dysphoria. Whether it takes the form they wanted is another question. As you might expect, this ruling has caught the attention of the world. After all, if a 14-year-old is too young to consent to puberty blockers in the UK, presumably 14-year-olds in the US and Canada and anywhere else are going to be much the same. As I predicted in my recent review of the book by Abigail Shrier, this issue was always going to end up in the courts as young people came to regret actions that they were too immature to fully understand. Didn't realise it would be quite so soon. My own take is that this is hugely welcome. It feels like the final scene of Lord of the Flies.
guys doing?
Of course, children can't consent to a process that will end in permanent alterations to their bodies. We don't let them drive. We don't say they're mature enough to consent to sex, which is nothing like as long-lasting and dangerous. So why on earth would any sane person conclude that they can't do any of those things, but they can decide to render themselves infertile? Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. And the court was the adult in the room asking the question, why are so many more people getting referred if this is just a medical condition? It would be nice to think this was an indicator that the grown-ups really are back and we can begin to behave like it. Unfortunately, most institutions continue to collaborate with stretching something that could be simple and respectful, pushing it into the realm of unreality. So, for instance, the actress Ellen Page announced this week that she's coming out as a transgender man and from now on will be known as Elliot and will use the pronouns he and they, which seems an odd blend, but fine. And good for the newly named Elliot Page. Absolutely old enough to make such a decision, absolutely should be accepted as the person that they want to be. The unreality only comes in as the activists insist and various establishments rush to confirm that this decision not only affects the future, how Elliot Page will now be referred to and treated, but the past. Suddenly the records have all been rewritten. Who was it who had a breakout role in the movie Juno? According to IMDb, it was Elliot Page. He got a breakout role playing a teenage girl. If you even mention Ellen Page in a purely factual, historical context, in a way that's perfectly respectful of the decision that's just been announced, you're nevertheless so-called dead-naming, and that's bad. The Transgender Journalist Association says that it's unacceptable for any media outlet even to mention the word Ellen. Go to Wikipedia and it seems that the whole acting career of Ellen Page has been transformed into the story of a young male actor, albeit one that it admits when it's talking about how he came out as a lesbian, that he was then presenting as female. Is it really not possible to frankly describe reality without it being held to give grave offence? She came out as a lesbian because she was a woman. She married her wife as a woman. That's history. It's factual account of what happened. She has now announced that she will in the future be known as Elliot. Indeed, the phrase presenting as would be appropriate here. He is a biological woman presenting as a man. Respectful people happily will act accordingly. Why would that be so hard to do? I mean, practically speaking, the outcome is identical, except that people don't have to pretend the past never happened, can't accidentally trip over saying the wrong thing. The line that activists were using on Twitter was, he has always been trans, and now he chose to come out, only his pronouns have changed. It's hard to hear that and not think of Orwell's 1984. Oceania is at war with Eastasia. Oceania has always been at war with Eastasia. When the institutions manage to deal with such issues in a straightforward way that respects people but also represents factual reality, then we'll know that the adults have really taken back control. Until then, it's going to be a wild ride. Now, in a moment, we'll have a look at the rest of the week's other news. But first, how does it make you feel when you hear the news that Singapore has now approved lab-grown chicken meat? That's meat, actual biological meat, that was grown artificially. No chicken was killed or harmed in its production. Chicken nuggets produced like this will soon be on sale in Singapore restaurants. What's the actual science behind how this is produced? Is this a vision of the future that die-hard meat eaters will embrace, maybe after some initial reluctance, as the way of the future? Will it end up being second-class meat, something that ends up in products only eaten by the poor who can't afford to be picky? Will current vegetarians embrace it because it no longer comes from systems of cruelty? Or will modern societies overall turn against it, as some of them have done against GMO technology, for instance? Make no mistake, the discussion about this, the ethics, the science, the safety, all of that is coming soon to a forum near you. Next week, I'll be taking a deep dive into all of it so that you don't have to. Join me for that video going live at 7 p.m. UK time, Monday next week, the 7th of December. So this was the week where the UK government passed the legislation to put the country under its three-tiered lockdown in spite of the biggest backbench Tory rebellion since the election. It was also the week when the first vaccine was finally approved and the country began mobilising the massive programme of making it available to all of those who need and want it. Truly a great moment as far as many were concerned, but there's no moment so great that politicians can't sabotage it. In this case, it was government ministers who managed it by boasting. First they said, thank God for Brexit, because the European Union is being all slow and bureaucratic, but now we're nimble and quick, and it's all because we're free. And that would have been a brilliant boost to the Brexit equation, given that it looks highly likely that we're going to hit a no-deal outcome next week. Unfortunately, it's not technically true, because we could have done what we did anyway under the existing rules, but it is sort of true, in that Europe is indeed being slow and bureaucratic. It won't make that much difference. In a month's time, nobody will remember or care. And if our rollout is as chaotic as Test and Trace was, we'll be back to kicking ourselves all over again. Then we had Education Minister Gavin Williamson going that little bit further. We've obviously got the best medical regulators, he said. Much better than the French have. Much better than the Belgians have. Much better than the Americans have. That doesn't surprise me at all, because we're a much better country than every single one of them, aren't we? What is the point of that? Now, astonishingly, not everybody was pleased to be told how inferior they are. I know, these uppity foreigners. Dr Anthony Fauci snapped back. We have the gold standard of a regulatory approach with the FDA. The UK did not do it as carefully, and they got a couple of days ahead. Which was like Dr Fauci, Mr Medically Responsible, sort of stirring up potential reluctance in the UK to trust the vaccine. As you would expect, there was a backlash, and Fauci was quick to apologise and to say that he didn't mean to suggest that the UK had cut corners, even though even he had to admit that that was the actual meaning of the words that he used. There wasn't a lot of ambiguity that you could hide behind. Meanwhile, the UK has been on very bullish Brexit form in other areas as well. One of the real benefits to Brexit is that Britain no longer has to go along with the EU's common agricultural policy. The EU just had a moment when it could have taken the opportunity to reform the CAP, widely held to be in desperate need of reforming. But, just like the French would rather see a no-deal Brexit than stand up to their fishermen, so too, they and others are definitely not feeling up to the challenge of aggravating their farmers. So they updated the CAP relatively untouched. Environmentalists were savagely critical that the EU has adopted a net zero climate policy, but were failing at the first test. The UK, meanwhile, liberated from the yoke of a policy that was never designed for its particular farming structure in the first place, is looking at dramatically cutting direct farm subsidies. The aim is that they'll have been halved by 2024 and phased out 3 years later. What subsidies there are will be payments for public goods. It's expected to include a sustainable farming incentive, which rewards things like improving soil health, restoring nature in ways to provide natural flood management, and landscape recovery programs, including peatland restoration and planting woodlands. So there are some real points of substance that Brexit Britain can indeed talk about, if it can bring itself to stop thumbing its nose at the other kids in the playground. But then, this is the country where for several days we were arguing about whether a Scotch egg constitutes a substantial meal. I kid you not. Since the rules in Tier 2 lockdown say that you can only drink alongside a substantial meal and then you have to leave once it's finished, which is just micromanaging nonsense. You're saying people should sit at a table, that's all. As though the virus is going to hold its ground at the sight of a Scotch egg, but it's going to move straight in for the kill if there's only a pint of beer. Seriously, the idiots really are in charge. And the same might be about to be true in the US. We don't know whether any of President-elect Biden's emerging team are going to be good or are indeed going to be idiots, because all people seem to be talking about is their skin colour and what sort of genitalia they have. So Politico reported this. The faces of the economic team President-elect Joe Biden unveiled publicly Tuesday included an African-American woman, a man born in Nigeria, an Indian-American woman, and just one white man. Okay, I added the bit, but seriously, the only thing they're talking about is race and sex. Are these talented people? Have they got really solid professional achievements in their presumably long careers? Or alternatively skeletons in the closet? Who cares? There's black ones, and there's brown ones, and there's lots of them with boobs and not too many penises. And that's the important thing. Take that, Martin Luther King, with your judging people by the content of a character, not the colour of their skin. But according to some, it's still not enough. The response from Asian American, Black and Latino Democrats, it's not enough. Texas Representative Vicente Gonzalez called last week for at least 5 Latinos to be appointed to cabinet-level positions. Asian American and Pacific Islander advocates are warning the Biden administration in writing it will be deeply disappointing if several AAPIs are not nominated to cabinet positions. Well, look, maybe they'll be lucky and all of those people will turn out to be immensely talented and able to work together as a team. I mean, the odds are completely against it if you choose in that way, but you never know. But it's a terrible message to send a country regardless. Everything's about race. Everything else is about sex. Plus, we're going to unite the country. Other things that happened this week. There was a study that suggested that with China and potentially the US now signing up to net zero carbon targets, the world would finally be on track to achieving something close to the Paris Agreement targets. Which is nice. The real question, of course, is whether countries actually deliver on the promises, because, talk is cheap. Boris Johnson, in that vein, announced that he's upping the programme on cutting short-term emissions 68% by 2030. Which at this precise point in the history of a country you would describe as a brave step. Some people use other terms. And there was a major scientific breakthrough as the DeepMind AI was able to crack how proteins really behave. We have no idea what that means, but there is great excitement that it will unlock huge leaps forward in particularly medicine in the future. And, in a week when the UN Secretary General was making yet another speech about how we've broken the world, it was a useful counternote to remind us what brilliant breakthroughs we're capable of and how many tools we now have at our disposal to solve the problems of the future. And of course, sure, when we solve those problems, we'll then start squabbling about who did it first and who did it best. But the point is, we'll do it. That's the biggest note of optimism amidst all of the stupidity. Now, in a moment, we'll respond to a couple of comments and do the final thought for the week. But first, water vapour is fundamental to life on Earth. It's an important greenhouse gas. It's the basis for clouds and rain. It's central to our ability to grow food. When you have less water vapour in the air, it can influence the intensity and frequency of wildfires. When you have too much water vapour in the air, it can make high temperatures more stressful for people and animals because it inhibits the cooling impact of sweating, perspiration. It's something we don't talk about much, but it is kind of important. Researchers have shown that recent changes in climate are having an impact on the amount of water vapour in the air. And they've identified what they describe as a humidity paradox, because what's happening ain't what we would have expected to happen. So what is the paradox and why is it important? I'll be taking a look at that in the second video next week, which will be released at 7 p.m. UK time on Wednesday 9th of December. If you're interested in non-alarmist, fact-focused analysis of what is and isn't happening to the world around us, then join me for that. A comment I received on the Q&A video this week, where I once again dismissed the conspiracy theories around the Great Reset. I live and work all over central London, and I can't help noticing a massive change in the atmosphere, from one of freedom and prosperity to one of economic collapse and oppression. The response to the virus is massively out of proportion already. I'm witnessing real scenes of despair, fear and misery. Can you then blame me for my suspicions? I don't need to watch YouTube conspiracists to have a sense of doom. I'm surrounded by it every day. Now, it's not about blame, but I would encourage you to sort out cause and effect. There have been massively negative consequences to the policy of governments in relation to COVID-19, and that's true whether you think those policies were justified or not. The missing link is any reason why you need a conspiracy theory to explain what is more readily explainable without one. So, governments panic in the early stages in the face of worst case scenarios presented by their advisors who have a built-in incentive not to understate how bad it will be. Certain politicians judge then that early and drastic actions demanded, and all the others feel the pressure to match those actions because their critics are telling them that their slower response is causing thousands of deaths. Now, all of that is explainable using normal human psychology. If what has happened has been wrong, that needs to be argued against. If it's what needed to happen in spite of the harm, that needs to be argued for. No part of that discussion does the injection of theories that this is all part of a secret plan by unprecedentedly competent and powerful plotters make that discussion more productive. So look, I'd say this. Things are bad at the moment. This will pass. It always has through history. If a lizard army makes its move tomorrow, you can laugh in my face as we get taken away in chains. Okay, one more quick one. If you can only catch COVID-19 and not get it again, why does everyone need the vaccine? What are the facts about reinfection? And is the talk of yearly COVID jabs true? None of what follows is medical advice, which you should never ever take from YouTubers. My understanding is that we simply don't know how long post-infection immunity might last. At the current position, the number of documented cases about reinfection are vanishingly small and seem, from what I've read, to be restricted to those who only had a mild infection first time round. But the data's not great, so that may be wrong. We just don't know. And bear in mind that if you only gained 6 months immunity from having had COVID, then the world will be poised on the edge right now of seeing a wave of reinfections, but you wouldn't know it until it started happening. Personally, if I'd had it, I wouldn't much be worrying about getting it again, but it comes down to your personal tolerance for risk, and as we've learned, people vary very wildly on that score. Now, Eton School is one of the most prestigious educational establishments in Britain. A fair number of the government ministers, chief executives and the rest of the elites have passed through it on their way to greatness. But this week it's been just another institution caught up in a cancel culture row. An English Master there, Will Knowland, has been sacked after he refused to remove a video he'd made from YouTube. It was a video for a lecture discussing the case against some of the current politically correct arguments about the patriarchy and biology. It was produced as part of a perspectives course and challenges the idea that there's anything toxic about masculinity. Knowland felt it was merited to counter the ideology that's increasingly being promoted by Eton's leadership team. Now, there was a complaint from a female colleague alleging that the content was degrading and humiliating and that allowing his lecture to go ahead would have been a form of discrimination against women. Mr. Knowland agreed to remove it from the school intranet, but refused to remove it from YouTube. Now, this isn't as simple as it looks. Free speech champions have been divided on it. The Free Speech Union founder, Toby Young, points to the head teacher, Simon Henderson, who has drifted into the woke ideology, promising to decolonise the curriculum and all other sorts of things. Free speech against such a philosophy needs to be defended, says Toby. But then in the same edition of The Spectator magazine as Toby said that, Charles Moore noted that Knowland was instructed by his boss to remove something from the public domain, which was his right. Schools are not universities where tenured professors can demand independence. School teachers are not allowed to simply inject their own curriculum. The thing that got him fired was not his beliefs, but his refusal to follow a legitimate instruction. It's one thing to disagree with the philosophy the school's following, but the head teacher has the authority to set it. If employees won't do what he wants, then they have to leave. Now, some on the right are demanding that the head teacher be replaced. If Eton, of all places, isn't going to stand against the thought police, then who will? Some then say that you kind of have the opponents of cancel culture calling for people to be sacked because of their opinions. But of course, if you're leading an organisation, it's not about whether you have the right opinions, but about whether you're following the right strategy for the good of the organisation. I think any school should think twice before establishing a culture based on ideology and where debate is outlawed. But certainly those schools that provide themselves in preparing the next generation of leaders. Simon Henderson should move on, not because he enforced his authority on a staff member who refused an instruction, but because a school determined to teach its children that masculinity is toxic and to permit no debate, that is not a school that is fit for purpose. Now, it seems as though I managed a bad thought myself in the previous video, because more than a week after it was published, it got demonetized by YouTube. Another reminder for me to be grateful for the good people who support this channel on Patreon. They enable me to put in the time that it takes to produce 3 videos or more per week, even though a number of them require quite a bit of time and research. So, if you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please consider signing up at patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.